Well, I thought about sharing today some interesting facts that people might or might not be aware about orchids in the tropical Andes. Before that, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Oscar Alejandro Perez Escobar, and I am a research group leader in working at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew over the last, it's going to be 9 years now. And my specialty is orchids, of course. Before we go into these cool facts, I want to, let's say, everyone think about how much do we really know about orchids? So let's just start by the simple fact of what is an orchid, right? So if you're a botanist, obviously you know what an orchid is, right? But if you are, let's say, a citizen who is not familiar with botany uh, or orchids at all, when you think about orchids, I guess that the first thing that will come to mind is this, right? That's the typical supermarket orchid that you can buy for £5 here in the UK. I don't know how much in Swiss money that is. That is a very hardy orchid that survives in most households if you give minimal care, right? That's a Phalaenopsis orchid. But I want to convince you today that orchids encompass much more diversity than this, right? So, do you think that this is an orchid? You say yes.
Yes.
I'm very curious to hear the opinion of the other plant experts here. Is this an orchid or not? Who wants to be brave enough
For
and comment?
me, also, yes.
Okay, so we have two yes. Any other volunteer? No, no worries. So that is in fact not an orchid, but it's a very interesting plant. It's a monocot, of course, like orchids, but it's something that is actually not closely related. What about this? Is this an orchid or not?
Yes.
For me, yes.
Good.
Yes.
Good guess. That's an orchid found in the tropical Andes, by the way. And you might have seen it somewhere as well in the supermarkets. There is a close relative that has been, let's say, cultivated widely, and you can also grow it in your flat. But let's say that the common understanding of public of an orchid is basically this. This image actually comes from ChatGPT. As you know, it's like an artificial intelligence software or algorithm that is built upon, let's say, knowledge that is stored in the internet. And this is the result that I got when I prompt this kind of, let's say, as a question to ChatGPT. Give me a typical orchid in full bloom. That's a phalaenopsis, which is not a real species, of course. It's a made image of an orchid, right? But as some of you know, orchids are much, much, much more than that. It's in fact one of the largest plant families on Earth that contains about 25,000 to 30,000 species that has near global distribution. And one of the things that characterize orchids is all the endless shapes, colors, smells, sizes that are the result of adaptations to multiple environments and interactions with different organisms and other plants, as we will see later. This is how you recognize an orchid. Basically, as many other monocots, you have floral organs which are arranged in sets of three. So you might have, can you see my cursor? Yeah. Okay. So a typical orchid
Yes.
flower will have one, two, three sepals, one, two, three petals, one of which is sometimes heavily modified and is different from the others and serves as a kind of a way to attract pollinators. And then another major feature of orchids is the fusion of the reproductive structures into one single structure, which we call column or gynostemium. So these terms might not be homologous, but that's how you find it in the literature sometimes. And you have here, which is a structure called pollinia, which is the aggregation of pollen masses, which you tend to find in most of the orchids, right? So that's how you can recognize an orchid. Thanks to the research that we have been doing here in Kew Gardens, we know that orchids, and of course, based on previous studies, we understand that orchids originated, the most recent common ancestor of all of them, around 80 to 90 million years ago. So you could say that actually they coexisted with dinosaurs. But also we have learned that the greatest majority of diversity of species that you see today, they have originated on the last 5 million years. So, which is of kind of recent origin. And as a matter of fact, one part of that diversity is found in the tropical Andes, as we will see later. If you want to learn more about research we have been doing here in Kew, I encourage you to scan this QR code, which will lead you to our paper, which was released last year. in case you are curious about learning more about the place of origin and the modes of speciation of orchids. And you can download this beautiful poster here for free under this link, which you can print. It's an A0 poster. Right, now that we have, let's say, a basic idea of what an orchid is and all the flavors and colors that you can possibly find, let's talk a bit about what the tropical Andes is. So the tropical Andes sits in the Andean Cordillera, which is a mountain system that extends for 5,000 kilometers. Tropical Andes can be defined roughly inside these boundaries. And it's very important because like tends to biodiversity hotspots, which are around 35 biodiversity hotspots being places on Earth that have, let's say, extremely high levels of diversity, species diversity, but are under threat. The tropical Andes is #1 in terms of plants, right? And includes about 15% of all global plant species diversity. And if you try to summarize that, let's say in the Earth's surface is about 1%. So that is extremely unique place, right? And then you have amazing plant diversifications. That being said, this is basically a plant diversification is when a group, a lineage, produce many species in short time periods. And you have here some of the most commonly known examples of plant diversifications, orchids being one of them. You have this fantastic Asteraceae, which we call in Spanish frailejones. That's from the genus Speletia and sister groups. You have lupines, which you also find in alpine zones in Europe. And you have some Ericaceae plants as well, like Macleania, for example. We have here the tropical Andes, by the way. So now that we have an idea of what the tropical Andes is and where it sits, oh, and I forgot to mention, by the way, tropical Andes ranges from Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, a little bit of Chile and Argentina. And this has a range of ecosystems that I will talk about a bit later. So perhaps one fact that people usually don't know about orchids in tropical Andes is that orchids could be one of the most dominant families in the tropical Andes itself. So for example, if you dissect the tropical Andes, the flora that occur in tropical Andes countries by intervals of elevation, if you take, for example, windows of 1,000 meters above sea level and you start counting the diversity of species of the most species-rich families, we'll find out that from 100 to 3,000 meters, orchids tend to be the most diverse species in the tropical Andes, right? So this means that you have many species occurring across different elevational gradients, and most of that diversity might be unique to that elevational gradient. So you won't find, for example, 100 species growing all of them from 0 to 3,000 meters. No, so they have very narrow distributions across this elevational gradient. But then you tend to find that, let's say, the highest levels of diversity of species in the tropical Andes occurs between 500 to 2,000 meters. That's like the peak of richness of orchids. After that, species richness starts to decline, and then that dominance gets replaced by other families, right? So, and this is because when you consider tropical Andes, it's not just an heterogeneous landscape, of course. Like many mountains, you have many different ecosystems. You have here just a few examples. Let's say those are my favorites. You have, for example, Andean and high Andean cloud forest. This photo was taken in Colombia at an elevation of around 2,000 meters. This is basically a photo taken on the western Cordillera, Northern Andes, facing the Pacific. So from this view onwards, you have the Pacific Ocean and a bunch of forests that start going down, and you have a confluence of environments that basically result in high levels of diversity, including orchids. You have paramos, which perhaps are the most iconic landscapes in the tropical Andes. They look a lot like the alpine zones that you see here in Europe. And then you have lowland tropical forests, which occur at the foothills of the Andes. And this actual environment is a little bit tricky because to put, let's say, a lower limit as to where the Andes start is very complicated, right? So, and let's say the lower boundary of the Andes, of the tropical Andes, can change from country to country. If you want to know more about this study, I would like to encourage you to see our review that we published in 2021. You can access it here. It's open access. Now let's go into a second, let's say, fact that often people don't know about orchids in tropical Andes, and it's that in practice, most of the orchid diversity, or let's say the country that has orchid diversity the most is Colombia, right? So I say in practice because technically speaking, Ecuador at the moment is the country that is diverse the most in terms of orchids. So Colombia is second. But if you compare, let's say, the proportion of area that has been collected in Ecuador versus Colombia, Ecuador has been much more explored for historical reasons. As you might know, Colombia has been embedded in war for decades, and that has prevented exploration, botanical exploration. And so many, many more species remain to be explored. So of the 23,000 plant species reported for Colombia, you could say that 20%, this number might have changed, and might be a little bit more because this number is old. That is 4,200 orchids are orchids. And then most of them, you could say that grow in the Andes because this has been the area that has been explored the most. And to give you an idea of what this orchid diversity look like, is something definitely much, much, much more, in my humble opinion, beautiful than the typical Phalaenopsis that you can find in the supermarket or Dendrobium on maybe perhaps some European orchids, which are beautiful, but I would say not as beautiful as this. With all due respect, of course.
No bias there.
So you have all sorts of different line forms. For example, you have tiny, tiny, tiny epiphytes. This flower here, for example, has 2 centimeters from tip to tip of sepal. Then you have epiphyte orchids which can reach 2 meters high. You have terrestrial orchids growing in paramos. These are 2 examples, Kranichis and Gonfikis. You have, for example, or epiphytes that have super short life cycles. This one, the Lipogon here, can actually grow on leaves that start to fall from trees because they can reach, for example, maturity, that is from seed to flower in just 6 months, right? You have terrestrial canes that can reach 3 meters high. And anyways, you have all sorts of orchids that you can imagine growing in the tropical Andes. So the message with this slide here is go and visit the tropical Andes. Orchid diversity there is amazing, mind-blowing. And wherever you look in cloud forest, for example, you can find orchids. But then, as some of you might know, and that's the third thing I want to share about orchids, which I guess maybe most people know, at least scientists, is that diversity is under threat because of climate change and deforestation. So you could say that, as far as some estimates go, 56% of orchid species are endangered of extinction. And these are based on automated estimations using artificial intelligence. These are not properly IUCN estimations, right? Because the number of species that we have estimated sent to IUCN and the levels of threatened are very, very few. And this graphic that you see here is an estimation on the change of forest coverage between 2000 and 2014. And basically all that you see here, what is areas in red, is changes in forest coverage loss. So basically forests that we have lost between these years. And as you can see, there's a bunch of red patches here sitting in tropical Andes, which is, as I said before, biodiversity hotspot. Is basically where orchids you tend to find them the most, right? This is where orchid diversity peaked the most in these tropical countries. So this picture is very concerning, so to speak. So it's a race against time to understand the orchid diversity that we are losing. Here's another example of how forest loss is going on. This is a study focused on my home country, Colombia. And this study was conducted in 2022 and studied the change of forest coverage in the Andean and Amazonian corridors. So these forests are very important and diverse because when you have, for example, ecosystems merging together from highlands and lowlands, you have ecotones, which tend to result in like explosion of biodiversity. And as you can see here, there is a massive forest coverage loss. Again, all these red tiles, specifically forest that has been lost between 2017 and 2020, which is interesting enough because during this time period is where Colombia signed the peace treaty. And you might know about FARC, which is one of the oldest guerrillas in the world. It's a terrorist group. They signed a peace treaty and they retreated, and all these areas where they were basically hiding became available for botanical exploration, but as well for, anyone who wanted to just basically go and start, logging for to establish grasslands and plantations, right? So again, this picture is very concerning for orchids. And as if this wouldn't be enough, then you have, of course, climate change. And the picture is as grim as well. So what you have here in this image on the top is basically annual temperature, precipitation, and seasonality calculated from 1950 to 2000, right? And these are projections on how much that temperature will increase if we keep as business as usual, basically, if we don't, let's say, take drastic measures to keep issuing or keep burning fossil fuels and so on. And if we don't take conscious and we stop, if we don't basically switch to renewable energies, right? And as you can see here, basically in average, for some tropical Andean countries, temperature might increase between 2040 and 2070 by 4 degrees. And then one very good question is, can orchids cope with that change? Would they have enough time to adapt and migrate? We don't really know, right? So I think that we have to do more research on that. So yeah, let's say that the situation, the reality is not really good for orchids and other plant diversity in tropical Andes. As a matter of fact, some studies, which you might be aware, have suggested that what might happen is that ecosystem will shift of altitudinal levels, and then things like, for example, paramos might disappear, which contain, of course, endemic diversity, orchid diversity. So this is why here, let's say my group and here in Kew Gardens, what we are doing is botanical exploration in the tropical Andes, try to understand that diversity that we might lose because of deforestation and climate change. So, for example, here we have my friend David Mayers from Mothers Foundation, and this is an exploration we did that was 2 years ago in a forest that was actually derived from reforestation, natural reforestation. And just in a simple visit, we found this orchid, which we think, based on morphological and DNA evidence, could be a new species. And what you have here is the botanical illustration. So I would like to highlight the fact that while we have herbarium specimens and collections, there's still a lot to discover in countries like mine, especially in the Northern Andes region, which is, while it has been studied, there is a lot of diversity yet to be discovered, but it's also the place where you have, let's say, most settlements, at least in Colombia, right? And one fourth fact that I wanted to share with you as well is that we could say that 1 in 2 epiphyte species, at least in the Northern Andes region, which is of the tropical Andes, the most species-rich part of the biodiversity hotspot, is an epiphyte, is an orchid, right? So when you consider the diversity of species in the nootropics, you have that 20% are epiphytes. These are basically plants that live on other trees, and they don't necessarily parasitize them. So I also like to highlight the fact that orchids are not parasites, despite the fact that they grow on trees, right? That's a common misbelief that people have. I often find people asking me, apart from how can I take care of my phalaenopsis, is that, hey, do you know if orchids are parasites because they grow on other trees? I'm like, no, absolutely not, right? They use trees as a support, but they don't parasitize the trees, right? So I hope that that's clear. So if you consider that 20% of all the tropical species are epiphytes, then of all of this percentage, you have that 62% of all the tropical epiphytes are orchids, right? And if you go to Northern Andes region, you have that 50% of Northern Andes epiphytes are orchids. And I highlight the fact of Northern Andes because that is the area in the whole tropical Andes where you have epiphyte species the most, like richness, right? And these are census-area estimates. So next time you go to the tropical Andes, like Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and parts of Peru, if you see an epiphyte, you have a, let's say, roughly 50% chance of it to be an orchid, right? Which is pretty cool. So you can, let's say, play a bit, like, if you don't know about botany, you could say, oh, this might be an orchid. I have 50% chance. Then you can look like a botanist, like, your thing. And let's say that for those of you who haven't got a chance to see how, let's say, tropical Andean forests look like, this is how it looks from a tree. So let's say from a viewer's perspective that, is able to fly on the trees. So this video was taken with a drone, and all that you can see here, say a big proportion of all of these plants, most of them are orchids, different species. Here you have one actually in flower, that's a Stelis. Then you have a bunch of other epiphytes like anthuriums, ferns, bromeliads. That's an orchid from the genus Stelis. So that actually explains why you have so many orchid species in tropical Andes, because they had, let's say, they managed to adapt to many, many, many different ecosystems across altitudinal ranges, but also inside these elevational gradients, inside trees, they managed to adapt to, let's say, the base of the tree, the top of the tree, the canopy, and that explains why you have so many orchids in tropical Andes. Great. One fifth thing that I wanted to share with you is that orchids have evolved amazing pollination strategies, some of which are actually, you could say, nearly exclusive of tropical Andes. And we have here two examples, which are, let's say, my favorite ones. So as you might know, orchids rely on animals and other vectors for pollination, right? So orchids might rely most of the time, at least between 40 and 50% of the times, on deception. They might not offer a reward, they might offer a reward. And then we have here two systems, which again are my favorite the most. We have here one group of orchids which are known or are called lepanthis, right? So that in Latin means like a scale on a bark. This is because these orchids are very small and they grow on the bark of trees, at the top, at the canopy, at the base of the tree. And what these orchids do actually is that they deceive some flies. So they make believe some male flies that they're actually the female fly. So what this poor fella here does, which is a extremely small fly, this flower, for example, could be 3 centimeters in size, is that it comes and copulates with this flower. And so in that way, the orchid is pollinated. The fly obviously is completely deceived. It doesn't get anything, it doesn't reproduce. So it has expense for the fly. And on this side, we have another mechanism which is fascinating. So when you think about angiosperms, so flowering plants, some of them might produce fragrances as a cue to say, look, if you come here, you might get a reward. Could be nectar, could be something else. But in this case, these orchids and fewer angiosperms, they have evolved fragrances as the mechanism of reward. So you have these tiny bees here, which are known as orchid bees or euglossini bees. And again, you have the males here. This time they are not being fooled. And this male here, for, let's say, copulation, it requires for them to collect a series of chemical compounds, which we can call fragrances, right? So they can source them from different parts of, trees, soil, and flowers. So in this case, this orchid produces a compound that this bee needs to produce a perfume, and then this male bee, what it will do is that it will attract a female bee. And every bee apparently produces a compound or a mix of compounds that is specific to attract another female bee, right? And while the bee comes and collects the compounds here in this structure, which we call lip, if we come back a few slides before, you could see that the lip is a heavily modified structure that can serve to attract pollinators, right? And as the bee collects these fragrances, it takes by chance the pollen masses, which you see here, and then puts them back in a different flower, right? So if you have an idea of how this happens, here is a video that was taken during my PhD many, many years ago in Panama. So you can see here the bee flying over the lip, and then let's say scruffing the lip to collect the chemical fragrances, and then hovering back slightly and then scratching the first pair of legs against the last pair of legs to store the chemical compounds, and by chance takes the pollinia. So this one already has an orchid pollinia there, you see. It's these yellow masses that you see on the back. So these orchids, as you're seeing here, they can grow in the lowlands of Amazonia and Chocó forest, but also on the foothills of the Andes. And these orchids, Lepanthis, can be found across the neotropics, but they are, let's say, diverse the most in mountainous areas of Central America and Northern Andes. Well, I hope that you enjoyed these 5 interesting facts about orchids in tropical Andes. As for the 5 ones, I would like to encourage you to get in touch with me because of time constraints. but also it's a strategy for the audience to get in touch with me and learn more about our research. I would like to thank my colleagues. The work that I shared today with you is obviously a group effort, but also like to thank my donors and supporters, including the Swiss Orchid Foundation, Q Foundation, and the Antonelli Lab. And yeah, happy to take any questions. Thanks.